And so hopefully today I will be able to introduce some complexity to the idea of bats, because they are also really, really good for ecosystems, and also really, really beneficial to humans. Okay, but then whenever you talk about bats, you do have to talk about disease. And so I'm going to talk about the idea of zoonotic disease, which is a disease that is transmitted from animals to humans, and the ecological conditions that allow for that to occur. Okay, but first, bat facts, because this week is Mammal Week in lab, and so I do have to go over some taxonomy and some interesting facts about bats, okay? So bats are in class Mammalia, order Chiroptera. Chiro means hand, Ptera means wing, and so that literally means hand wing. And that refers to the fact that they fly using skin that is spread between their fingers. Okay, so they've got this little thumb that points out, and then the wing is actually their hand. They fly more with their hands than with their actual arms. And they are the only mammals that are capable of true and sustained flight. There are mammals that glide, sugar gliders, flying squirrels, but they don't do flapping flight. Bats are the only mammals that are capable of flying for long distances. And they are more agile in flight than most birds. So we think of birds as the flying animals, but bats do it better in a lot of cases. There are over 1,400 species. They are second, I put this later, I should have put it here, but they are second only to rodents in the number of species in class Mammalia. Okay, so they are a very, very diverse group of mammals. And they are found on all continents except for Antarctica. The number of species of bats present is in red, it's higher numbers are in red, and then lower numbers are in blue. And so they are in the highest diversity here in Central and South America, although there's quite a bit of diversity over here in Asia, and then parts of sub-Saharan Africa as well. Okay, but equatorial, high diversity, as is the rule for every other organism that we have looked at in this class. Okay. But here in Nebraska, we have 90 mammal species that are found here, and 13 of those are bats. There are lots of bat species here, okay? And this is a few of them. They tend to be sort of large for the bats that are found here in the U.S. Okay. But there are bats here in Nebraska as well. So they are order Chiroptera, and then there are two suborders. There's Mega Chiroptera and Micro Chiroptera. So there are the big hand wings and the little hand wings. Okay. The Mega Chiroptera, these have only one family, Pteropidae. These are also called flying foxes, old world bats, or fruit bats. Okay. Whereas the Micro Chiroptera, there are 16 families of these, so that's considerably more diverse. Okay. And this is the largest bat in the world. This is the giant golden crowned flying fox. Okay, so the Mega Chiroptera, you can see why they are called mega. That's a big old bat. Okay, and then the smallest bat in the world is the bumblebee bat. This also happens to be the smallest mammal in existence, even at full size. They fit in the palm of your hand. Adorable little babies. Okay, so suborder Mega Chiroptera. These are flying foxes. You can see why they might be called that. They do have sort of a fox-looking face. They are also called fruit bats or old world fruit bats, because these are found only in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. Okay. Most of these are nocturnal, which means they are active at night, or they are crepuscular, which is a great word that means active at dawn and dusk. Okay. So they wake up around dusk and go out hunting, and then they will sleep through the night to wake up again around dawn to go out and hunt again. Okay. These are exclusively herbivorous. So they feed on fruit or nectar. Some species will roost alone, whereas others roost in colonies with up to 1 million individuals. Okay, so some of them are solitary, some of them are quite social. Here, I believe this was taken in Sydney, Australia. Bat, bat, bat. Okay. So they've got little tendons in their feet that will lock into place when they are hanging so that no energy is required. If we were to sleep hanging from our hands, we would fall, right? Because you need to keep up that energy. Whereas they have little tendons that'll lock them in place so that they can sleep hanging upside down, roosting, without expending any energy to do so. Okay. That's Megachiroptera. Fruit bats, flying foxes. Suborder Microchiroptera, these are what we have here in the States. Okay, so the Microchiroptera are primarily insectivorous, so they eat insects. They can also be frugivorous, which means eating fruit or nectar, or they can be hematophagous, which means they drink blood. Ooh. This is why they're associated with vampires, okay? And Microchiroptera are the bats that use echolocation. Megachiroptera, the fruit bats, don't do that. Okay? They are primarily visual, auditory, etc. Microchiroptera are capable of producing sound waves with special structures in their faces. Those sound waves, when they hit an object, will come bouncing back. And then their little bat brains are capable of interpreting that sensory information as location and speed. Okay? They often will have little structures in their ears that allow them to better detect these sound waves. And they will also often have ugly little folds on their faces that help them to produce those sound waves in a specific way. So ugly, they're cute. Okay. So, bats tend to use echolocation to locate insects, but they can also use it to locate plants. There are plants that are pollinated by bats that have specific structures on them that will reflect sound waves back to that bat in a specific way. Okay, so this is showing the flowers and the fruit of this plant that relies on these bats to pollinate them, and they have this little cup shape on their stem that will reflect the sound waves back to the bat. And here's the tongue of a bat drinking nectar. Okay, so they're very moth-like in how they do that. So pollination is really important for plants. It is the transfer of pollen from one plant to another, pollen being the male gamete. And so plants that are pollinated by animals are heavily dependent on these animals in order to have sex. So even to produce the next generation, they need these pollinators. Because of this intimate relationship between plants and pollinators, the plants tend to be specialized to attract their specific pollinator. Okay, so, for example, plants that are pollinated by bees will often have special landing pads that is only visible in the ultraviolet spectrum, because bees can see in UV, we cannot, okay? And so it looks a little different for a bee. Plants that are pollinated by hummingbirds will tend to be bright red and rather small flowers, okay? Because birds can see the color red, bees cannot. Plants that are pollinated by bats usually only bloom at night, okay, when bats are active. They tend to be very pale or white in color because bats, like most mammals, are pretty much colorblind, and so having a color, not necessary, and might be expensive, so they're pale. They also tend to be large, as bats tend to be larger than things like hummingbirds or bees, and they also tend to be very fragrant, okay, often a very sickly sweet sort of scent. And vampire bats, something recently was discovered about them that I think is pretty cool. So, do you guys remember talking about altruism? Self-sacrifice, right, for the benefit of somebody else. So, vampire bats are really social, Okay, so they roost in these large groups. And the females, in particular, are very, very social. Okay, they will groom each other, which in primates as well is an important social cohesion mechanism. You picking off like lice and stuff. I don't know. Do you guys ever popped like zits for somebody? I don't know. That's the modern equivalent of that, in my opinion. Okay, it brings you closer together. Trust me. Okay, and so they'll groom each other, but then also, so they all go out at night to try and feed. They'll like make a little slit in a mammal's skin, and then they'll lap up the blood that pools there. Some females will be unsuccessful at this, and others will be. And so the females, when they return to the roost, some of them will regurgitate blood into the mouth of a female who did not successfully acquire a meal that night. But they don't do this indiscriminately. They tend to prefer their friends. Okay? Now, however you want to define friends, what this means is that there are certain bats that they groom more often. There are certain bats that they just have these social interactions with more often. There are these little bat cliques, right? And the females are going to share blood within their friend group much more readily than they will outside of it. You guys in love with bats in? No? Okay. Other questions before we get on to their benefits for ecosystems and humans? So bats are beneficial. This figure is showing the economic worth of bats in terms of the insects that they eat. One estimate is that they provide services worth $3.7 billion every year for agriculture. And this doesn't even touch on their mosquito control benefits. Okay? Without bats, we would need to spray way more pesticides into the environment, which can have unintended effects. This is very natural pest control, okay, and they do it really, really, really well. They also, especially fruit bats, will reseed cut forests. So a clear cut or a burned area will grow back quite slowly if there are no bats around. But bats eat fruits. Fruits contain seeds. The seeds are indigestible, so they will fly over these clear-cut or burned areas and poop out these seeds in this nice, nutritious little fertilizer packet. Okay? And so, if there are bats around, forests grow back more quickly. They also pollinate plants. Here's a little guy covered in pollen. Okay? So their pollination services are also quite important economically because a lot of plants can't do it without them. And some of the cash crops that they provide these pollination services for include bananas, mangoes, cashews, agave, and cocoa. So bats help produce chocolate. And if that isn't enough to convince you that bats are awesome, I don't know what to say to you. Guano, which is the term for their goop, is also a really great fertilizer because not only does it fertilize crops, but it is also a natural fungicide, so it kills funguses, and a natural nematicide, so it kills roundworms, which means that rather than dumping multiple chemicals on crops, you can just use guano, and it takes care of those services. There have been conflicts worldwide during colonization over islands and areas that have a good guano supply. Okay? People have died fighting over guano. That's how valuable it is now, historically. I read an article about that recently. Okay. Also, another way they've benefited humans is that their echolocation inspired the idea for radar and for sonar. Okay, so by studying these bats and what they do and how they get around, we have developed certain technologies. Okay. just like everything we talk about in this class, they're also under threat. Okay, so this figure is showing the proportion of species that are classified in each of these IUCN categories. Okay, so a lot of them are doing just fine. They are species of least concern. But then there are probably about 200, over 200, that are either threatened, vulnerable, or endangered. Okay, and there are a number of threats that they are under. The first and the most important, as always, is habitat loss. They live in, they tend to prefer wilder areas, okay? And so as those wild areas are destroyed, as forests are cut down, their populations simply can't sustain themselves. They don't have the food sources, they don't have the spaces that they need. Also, something that I have not yet mentioned in this class, I think I've only talked about my love of cats, but feral cats in the United States alone kill over 6 billion small birds and mammals every single year. Okay? Feral cats are the most damaging invasive species known to man, and nobody is managing them. Okay, so bats are also killed by cats quite a bit. Also, lighting. So bats tend to be nocturnal animals. Whenever there are bright areas, as we light up the world, that disrupts their natural activity. Wind farms also cause some mortality. It's on like orders of magnitude less than cats, but it still is a thing. Bats and birds do run into turbine arms and die. Then also human culling. So this is an issue sometimes when a new disease emerges. The solution proposed by some municipalities is to just kill all the bats. Okay? And so that occasionally happens. And then they are also having their own fungapocalypse. There's a fungal disease that is absolutely decimating some bat populations. It's called white nose syndrome. Okay. So white nose syndrome is a fungal disease. Okay, you can see why it's called white nose syndrome here. You've got the little fungal hyphae growing on this poor bat's nose. And it primarily affects torpid bats. Okay, so torpor, it's that daily reduction in metabolism and temperature. Funguses tend to prefer lower temperatures. Okay, they can't survive at the temperatures that mammals generally maintain. But a torpid bat would be capable of growing this fungal disease. And as it grows, it changes the bat's behavior. So it makes them more active when they should be torpid. And the point of torpor is to preserve energy, right? And so as they are more active, they'll be burning through their energetic reserves, meaning that they will have less to sustain them through hard times. And the fungus can also damage their wings, which obviously they're pretty dependent on their wings for living. Okay. So white nose syndrome was first detected in 2006, and since then it has been spreading rapidly across the US, across Europe, and across Asia. This is the map showing its spread across the United States. Purple and blue, these are the early detections. Okay, so apparently it got to the US about then, probably shipments from somewhere of something, and since has been spreading in both directions until it was in 2021 and 2022 found in Wyoming and the West Coast. So this is definitely a thing that's happening. So people mentioned rabies, people mentioned COVID, people mentioned disease. Okay? Bats do seem to be, seems like whenever there's a novel disease that emerges into the human populations, we ultimately trace it back to bats. Okay, so SARS-CoV-2, this most recent pandemic, ultimately traced back to bats. Ebola, probably ultimately traced back to bats. SARS-CoV-1, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the first SARS, the first coronavirus pandemic, traced back to bats. There is a Hendra virus that emerges every couple of years and completely, like the mortality in horses is something like 80%. The mortality in humans is lower, but it can affect us. There's Nipah virus, like there's so many. There's so many, especially viruses, that ultimately come from bats, okay, which is why there are sometimes these calls to just kill them all. And so we are going to talk about these zoonotic disease events called spillovers. But first, some terminology. So bats are considered to be good disease reservoirs. You guys have probably heard the word reservoir as like the water that's held back by a dam, or it's like the well from which we draw. That's true in this sense as well. So a reservoir is one or more epidemiologically connected populations in which the pathogen is permanently maintained and from which infection is transmitted to the defined target population. Okay, so in this schematic, there's a disease reservoir, which is where that virus, we'll just focus on virus, naturally maintains itself. Okay, they may or may not be affected by it, so that it may produce symptoms, it may not produce symptoms. Okay, but whether or not they have symptoms, they are capable of transmitting it to perhaps a vector population. Vector would be another species that could then transmit it to humans, okay, or horses in the case of Hendra, or whatever species is of interest, or potentially it could be transmitted directly from the reservoir into the target population. Okay. So, the ability to be infected does not make a reservoir. The infectiousness of the animal is more important. So that means, they need to be able to transmit it past that species, okay, to a new species. That is what makes a zoonotic disease reservoir. And reservoirs are often unaffected by the disease, but they don't have to not be affected by the disease, okay? So the reason many reservoirs aren't affected by the disease is because they've had it for a really long time, which means that the individuals that would be sickened have already died off, their genes removed from the population, and so only non-susceptible individuals remain, right? And so often, a reservoir is unaffected by the disease, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't, okay? So they can produce symptoms. But being unaffected also means that they will be able to transmit for a lot longer, okay? If a virus sickens something and that something dies, then they can only transmit that disease from the time they are infected to the time that they died. If they are unaffected by it, then they can shed that virus for very long periods of time. Okay. All right. So when talking about zoonotic disease, we also need to introduce this term spillover. Spillover refers to that moment when a virus jumps species. Okay, so it's just naturally circulating in the wild animal, okay, at some low level. Okay, that's what this sort of peach color is, these wild animal cases. And then something happens where it jumps hosts, either to a domestic animal, okay, so camels or cows or whatever, chickens, okay? And then from there, it might then spill over into the human population. Or it could spill over directly from the wildlife population into humans. Okay? But spillover is that moment when it enters into a new animal population. How does this happen? Okay, so we're focusing on bats. Remember, bats aren't the only disease reservoir, but they carry some nasty ones. Okay, so bats, and I mean all mammals really, will shed virus in their body fluids, okay? And so diseases can be transmitted through direct contact with bat saliva, either through bites or scratches or through vampire bat saliva, okay? So that's direct contact. There can also be indirect contact with their body fluids through urine or feces or fruit dropped by fruit bats. Okay, so you've got fruit bats who are messy eaters. They just kind of chompa, 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 and then this pre-masticated fruit falls to the ground, which if it happens to be around domesticated animals, they can be like, ooh, that's already chewed for me, that looks great, right? Eat that, become infected, and then these pigs become, or they come into contact with a farmer, and then it spills over into the human population. And in some countries, bats are eaten. Especially in Asia, there's this, I forget what they call it, but it's like wild meat, okay? Here we call it game, right? And it's just more prevalent there, where they have people who go out into the forest and harvest wild meat and then bring it back to markets, okay? These markets tend to have a whole bunch of different species of wild animals, transported potentially live and held in cages that are in very high density and stacked one on top of each other. Okay, so if you've got a bunch of bats on top carrying all these viruses and they are peeing and pooping through the holes of something else into another mammal's cage, there's an opportunity for disease transmission. Also, in these wet markets, that is often the site of slaughter, and so you've got bats being cut open, blood everywhere, you know, a cut on as somebody's preparing it, blood gets in, bam, disease transmission. Okay, so once a bat is cooked, the virus is cooked too. Okay, they're made of RNA and proteins. They can't survive high temperatures. So that you guys, I don't know if you guys were something about bat soup. Like you're not going to get COVID by eating bat soup, but somebody at that market that slaughtered a bat might get COVID from slaughtering that bat. Okay. All right. Questions about that? Okay. So, seems like every new disease we trace back to bats. So why? What makes them so good at harboring these diseases that can then infect us? Okay. So first of all, evolution. If you look at the phylogeny, and we're going to look at the mammal phylogeny in lab this week, bats are our sister species. Okay, so if you trace bats back to the most recent common ancestor, you trace primates back to the most recent common ancestor, that's it. Okay. Of all the other mammal species, we are most closely related to bats, which means that we probably share a lot of the receptors in common on the cells. Okay, we're closely related, there hasn't been time for stuff to mutate, et cetera, et cetera. We talked about how on the surface of viruses, they'll have these proteins that allow them to unlock a cell and get in, okay? And so it's very likely that bat cells are very close to our cells, okay? So we're just gonna be affected by similar diseases as bats are, okay? Also, there's new evidence that these viruses have been evolving, co-evolving with bats for a very, 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 very long time. Thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, okay? And so the bats can become affected, but they are resistant to them. So they shed the virus, but they don't get sick from it. And bats are the most abundant mammals in the world. 1 in every 4 mammal species is a bat. Okay, so there's just a lot of them. Second most populous mammals after rodents. Also, bat roosts can be very, very dense. Okay, so this is a bunch of bats returning to this cave. And so there's a high opportunity for pathogen transmission within that roosting spot as well. There are some caves that reach up to 300 bats per square foot. Picture a square foot. Okay, they do not so really good those. Okay, they're transmitting stuff all the time. And they often use different caves, and so a pathogen that they picked up in one cave could be then brought to another cave and transmitted to a whole new population of bats. Okay, so there's plenty of opportunity for viral exchange between bats, and there's plenty of opportunity for reassortment of those viruses. When more than one virus infects the same host, they can just swap portions of their genetic material. Super fast evolution. Okay. Bats also migrate for very long distances. The Tuderida brasiliensis, which we have here in Nebraska, migrates at least 800 miles every year. Okay, so these are migratory animals. They can bring novel, exotic pathogens wherever they end up going. Okay, and so there could be an East Coast bat species and a West Coast bat species that happen to roost together in the same area in Central America. And so even though they are going to and coming from different places, the viruses could be exchanged on their migratory pathways. Also, they go torpid and they hibernate, which means that there are certain areas in the time of the year and times of the day where their metabolisms are decreased, which also seems to decrease their immune response as well. Okay, so they are just more susceptible to viruses than non-torpid animals. I realize I'm speaking through this, but that's okay. And their hibernacula, it's not a great word for the place where they hibernate. These tend to be very densely populated, as I mentioned before, sometimes by multiple bat species at once. Okay, so they're packed in together, swapping viruses. The viruses are reassorting, evolving, etc. Okay. Well, there also seems to be something special about the bat immune system. And science itself doesn't know a ton about this, but it is a frontier of science right now. Because if we can figure out how their immune system reaches this sort of ceasefire between themselves and viruses, then we might be able to leverage that to help human beings as well. Okay? And so a lot of research is going on into bat immune systems right now because very little is known about it. What we do know is that bats tend to not get sick from viruses. Wouldn't that be nice, right? But they can shed the viruses sometimes for over 100 days. Okay, so even though they're not sick, the virus is replicating and being shed in their body fluids. And what it looks like is that their immune systems it'll sort of control viral populations, but won't actually clear them. Okay, and so this might be because there are fewer cytokines released. Okay, so those alarm signals just aren't putting the rest of the immune system on alarm, and it looks like their antibody response to viruses is reduced as well. That's about all we know at this point in time, though. Okay. Did you guys know? Have you guys heard of this coronavirus epidemic being called SARS-CoV-2? Okay. That's because there was a SARS-CoV-1. There was a coronavirus outbreak that occurred in 2002 that caused a severe acute respiratory syndrome. Okay, so you've got SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, caused by a coronavirus, and this was the first that was detected. Okay, 2002. The earliest cases, this should be familiar to you, were associated with the wildlife meat industry. Okay, so it was first detected in people that were associated with these wildlife markets that I described before. Okay, so they are directly handling wildlife that are brought together for food. Okay? And there were some, in the early days, we thought that it came from palm civets, this guy, raccoon dogs, or hog badgers. Aren't these names great? They sound like Pokemon. Okay. But those were likely just incidental hosts. Okay. And so the interesting thing, many diseases that spill over into human populations just kind of stop there. Somebody gets sick, and that's a dead end. Okay. So far, bird flu has generally reached this dead end and hasn't reached any sort of epidemic or pandemic proportions. But bad stuff happens when it can then be transmitted human to human. Okay? So, a human gets it at a wildlife market from wildlife. If they cannot then transmit it to another human being, sucks for them, right? If they can transmit it to another human being, sucks for the human race, okay? And SARS-CoV-1, there was subsequent human-to-human transmission. By March of 2003, it had reached many areas of the world, including Canada, with a worldwide case fatality rate of 9.6%. That means that 10% of the people who were infected by SARS-CoV-1 died from it. It's pretty high. It's way worse than SARS-CoV-2. Okay? But the pandemic was ended by June. Okay? Public health measures, highly effective. People were isolated, and the pandemic died out. Okay? Very recently, it was traced definitively to this handsome bat here. It's a horseshoe bat in China. And they have found strains of this virus still circulating in caves in China. Hooray. Okay. There are teams of people whose job it is to go into caves in China, swab bats, and sequence the viruses that they have so that they can monitor and hopefully keep human beings safe. Okay. All right, what about MERS-CoV? Have you guys heard of MERS? This is a Middle East respiratory syndrome. It is caused by a coronavirus, and it was first reported in 2012 in Saudi Arabia. Okay. Camels are the intermediate host. The reservoir host is bats. Why would this be in here if not? Okay, I don't think I really need to say that, okay? This one has a 35% case fatality rate. Okay, so 35% of the people who get infected die from MERS, okay? Luckily, human-to-human transmission is very limited, okay? It does occur, but you are far more likely to get this from a camel than you are to get it from a human being, okay? So if you're not in contact with camels, you're probably pretty safe from MERS. And insectivorous bats are the likely source of this because we've found that it is highly related to another bat coronavirus that's circulating in those insectivorous bats there in the Middle East. Okay. And then we've got SARS-CoV-2, severe acute respiratory syndrome caused by a coronavirus, and the outbreak started in 2019, okay? And it's still happening. Now it's just pretty much a disease that's gonna circulate in the human population forever. Hooray. This isn't one of those public health success stories, okay? We did not manage to get a grip on this one, as you guys know. Luckily, it has about a 1% case fatality rate. Okay, so far less deadly than the other coronaviruses that we have talked about, although 1% is still 1 in 100 people. And if that 1 in 100 people is someone you love, that's still a pretty big deal, okay? So just because it's 1%, we shouldn't say that this is nothing. And it takes forever to figure out the ecology and evolution of these diseases, but it likely came from bats. We have found a coronavirus that is very, very closely related to SARS-CoV-2, and again, likely through an intermediate mammalian host. Okay, so probably at one of these wildlife markets, bats were brought into, the leading suspect is pangolins. Okay, so a bat gave coronavirus to a pangolin, which already had a coronavirus. Those coronaviruses swapped some of their genetic material, and then that virus was capable of infecting human beings and being transmitted human to human. Okay, that's the leading hypothesis. Now, why did we get a handle on SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 got way out of hand? Good question, class. Glad you're ahead of me on this. Okay, so there are lots of similarities and a few differences between the two. Okay, so that's what this figure is showing. I'm not going to go through this bit by bit. You can look at that on your own. But The main difference is that with SARS-CoV-1, people were most contagious when they were symptomatic. Okay, so somebody was already coughing, sneezing, had a fever. And so the traditional public health measure of just isolating sick people worked. Okay, you get somebody who's sick, transmission is cut off. With SARS-CoV-2, it's most effectively spread before symptoms appear. Okay, so transmission occurs more frequently in those first few days before you get a fever, before you start coughing, before you start sneezing. And that is why that new thing of masking up, everybody masking up, was implemented. Because that's the only way to halt this kind of thing without completely shutting down society. Okay, and obviously that had mixed results. Okay, just didn't really get a hold of this one. Okay, so these new diseases are emerging all the time, and they are a natural consequence of how we interact with our world, human ecology. And so bats carry more than 4,000 different strains of coronaviruses. And so to prevent future pandemics, knowing that this has happened now 3 times that we know of, we have to figure out how this happens so that we can try and prevent it from happening again. Okay? These are ecological factors. So these are things that are required for spillover to occur from an animal population into the human population. Okay, so first of all, the reservoir has to be present. There need to be bats. Okay? They also must be infected and shedding virus at sufficient dose to infect another animal. Okay? Humans or intermediate animals must be present and susceptible, and so they have to be at the same physical location. I know that sounds so simple. It's like so much science goes into saying, oh, well, you know, it's most probable when bats and humans come into contact. But then we identify the areas where bats and humans come into contact, right? So the expansion of human activity into bat habitat. Whenever humans enter a forest and start destroying it, it's like we're shaking trees and viruses are gonna fall out, okay? So that is one avenue. Humans going into bat habitat. But then there's also habitat loss. The bats lose their territory, and so they move into ours. They start coming into closer contact with our farms, with our livestock, and in our cities. Okay, so both of these involve habitat loss. And sort of the last point that I want to drive home is that these viruses, these diseases aren't really new. We call them novel because it's the first time that we know of that the human population has encountered them. But they're not new. They've been circulated in wildlife for thousands, tens of thousands, millions of years. Okay, these are not new diseases. What's new is us coming into contact with them. Okay, it's our own activities that are new. And so only when conditions are aligned exactly right does this occur. Okay, so bats and humans need to be in the same place. There needs to be some sort of spillover, and then that virus has to be transmitted human to human. These are low probability events, but low probability events, given enough time, given enough opportunity, are nearly unavoidable. Okay. So the main lesson is, with habitat loss, with the encroachment of humans into previously wild areas, these diseases are going to continue to emerge. It is just an inevitability. And a healthy environment means healthy humans in a very, very, very real way. It is one health. The health of our earth affects the health of human beings, okay? And I think that this is one of the most compelling arguments for conservation of wild areas that exists today, especially because of what happened with coronavirus. Questions? feel about bats now? Any different from when you walked in? Maybe I should end with the pollination stuff? Killing all bats isn't gonna help anything.